Hello, good evening. Welcome everybody. I'm just going to give my friend at the back there a nod. Great. Hi. Hello, welcome. Welcome everybody to Writers Return. This is an event series in which writers tell stories about their international travels with the British Council and reflect on how travel can inspire and inform their writing. The British Council, for those of you who don't know, is the UK's cultural relations organisation. We work in education, society and the arts, creating international opportunities and building connections between the UK's people and institutions and those around the world. Someone asked me at the last Writers' Return if I was the British Council's in-house David Tennant impersonator. I'm not a Time Lord, I'm afraid, but I do work in the British Council's literature department, and I'm thrilled and honoured to be sharing the stage with two wonderful writers who share a restless curiosity for the world and have suitcases of experience to show for it. Kei Miller is a Jamaican poet, essayist and fiction writer, currently living in Brixton. His recent collection, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, won the 2014 Forward Prize for Best Collection and was shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards in the poetry category just yesterday. Brilliant timing. We're very glad to have him here. It's a beautiful and arresting collection that pits the rationality of a mapmaker against the full-blooded beliefs of a Rasta as they debate their way towards a reckoning day. He has recently travelled with the British Council to Brazil and Iraq, and we'll hear more about that shortly. Elif Shafak is an award-winning Turkish novelist. She writes in both English and Turkish and is translated into over 40 languages. She divides her time between Turkey and the UK. Shafak blends Western and Eastern traditions of storytelling, bringing out the voices of women, minorities, subcultures, immigrants, and global souls. Her new novel, The Architect's Apprentice, is out now with Penguin. It's a novel with Dickensian sweep and scale, which delves into a historical period when her great muse, the city of Istanbul, and its iconic skyline was rising up. Her TED Talk on the politics of fiction has been viewed 1 million times. I like to think of this as the unofficial sequel. We're delighted to be here at the International Anthony Burgess Foundation in the presence of a writer who was himself a restless traveller. During the 60s and 70s, Burgess travelled Europe in a dormobile, that's a mobile home for those of you who weren't born in the 50s, and has this to say about it. It was a little over 20 years since my wife and I bought a Bedford dormobile. This was the trade name for a vehicle of British manufacture meant to serve as a mobile home. The bodywork was of fiberglass, plain of appearance, not lacking elegance, giving the vehicle the look of a large ambulance. The interior was equipped for driving, cooking, eating, sleeping, living. By an ingenious adjustment of stout screens, the whole could be turned into 2 bedrooms which collapsed to form a dining room with a bar at one end. The whole was a miracle of economy. It was home. In some ways, it is the only home I have ever seriously acknowledged. Tonight we'll be continuing this spirit and taking our Writers' Return dormobile from Kingston to Istanbul and back again. Please join me in welcoming Kei and Elif. So we're going to hear a reading from Elif and then from Kei, and then we'll have some questions. Please do put up your hands, don't be shy. We'll be having questions too from our live stream audience. The hashtag is Writers Return. If you tweet at us, we will ask your question. Great, so thank you, Elif.
Good evening. It's such a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion together that we're going to have. Just a few words about the book for those of you who might not be familiar with the story. The Architect's Apprentice takes place in 16th century Ottoman Istanbul, and the century is an interesting one for me. This was supposed to be the height, the zenith of the Ottoman glory, Ottoman power. The story that I am telling revolves around the personality of Sinan, who's regarded as the greatest architect in the Islamic world. Not many people in Turkey recognize the fact that he was born a Christian. Most probably he was Armenian or Greek, and he was converted to Islam at the age 21. I always wondered what that caused in his soul, inside his, in his psychology. He was asked to surpass the dome of Christianity, the dome of Hagia Sophia, and to build bigger mosques. But the more I concentrated on his work and on his personality, I have come to believe that the dome for him was an all-embracing concept. There was equal room under this invisible dome for Jews and Christians and Muslims and Zoroastrians, for everyone equally. So the story concentrates on Master Sinan, but is told through the eyes of his apprentices, of minorities, people whose voices we do not hear in Turkish official historiography. Animals too are very important in the story, particularly a white elephant that was sent as a royal gift from India to the Ottoman palace. And the voice that you will be hearing right now is the voice of Cihan, one of his apprentices. He's older now. He looks back and is talking about his work with Master Sinan. Of all the people God created and Shaitan led astray, only a few have discovered the center of the universe, where there's no good and no evil, no past and no future, no I and no thou, no war and no reason for war, just an endless sea of calm. What they found there was so beautiful that they lost their ability to speak. The angels, taking pity on them, offered two choices. If they wished to regain their voices, they would have to forget everything they had seen, although a feeling of absence would remain deep in their hearts. If they preferred to remember the beauty, however, their minds would become so befuddled that they would not be able to distinguish the truth from the illusion. So the handful who stumbled upon that secret location, unmarked on any map, returned either with a sense of longing for something they knew not what, or with multiple questions to ask. Those who yearned for completeness would be called the lovers, and those who aspired to knowledge, the learners. That is what Master Sinan used to tell the four of us, his apprentices. He would regard us closely, his head cocked to one side, as if trying to see through our souls. I knew I was being vain, and vanity was unfit for a simple boy such as I, but every time my master would relate this story, I believed he intended his words for me rather than for the others. His stare would linger for a moment too long on my face, as if there was something he expected from me. I would avert my gaze, afraid of disappointing him, afraid of the thing I could not give him, though what that was I never figured out. I wonder what he saw in my eyes. Had he predicted that I would be second to none with respect to learning, but that I, in my clumsiness, would fail miserably in love? I wish I could look back and say that I have learned to love as much as I love to learn. But if I lie, there could be a cauldron boiling for me in hell tomorrow, and who can assure me tomorrow is not already on my doorstep, now that I am as old as an oak tree and still not consigned to the grave. There were 6 of us, the master, the apprentices, and the white elephant. We built everything together: mosques, bridges, madrasas, caravansarais, almshouses, aqueducts. It was so long ago that my mind softens even the sharpest features, melting memories into liquid pain. The shapes that float into my head whenever I hark back to those days could well have been drawn later on to ease the guilt of having forgotten their faces. Yet I remember the promises we made and then failed to keep every single one of them. It's strange how faces, solid and visible as they are, evaporate while words made of breath stay. They have slipped away, one by one. Why it is that they perished and I survived to this feeble age, only God and God alone knows. I think about Istanbul every day. People must be walking now across the courtyards of the mosques, not knowing, not seeing. They would rather assume that the buildings around them had been there since the time of Noah. They were not. We raised them. Muslims and Christians, craftsmen and galley slaves, humans and animals, day upon day. But Istanbul is a city of easy forgettings. Things are written in water over there, except the works of my master, which are written in stone. Beneath one stone I buried a secret. Much time has gone by, but it must still be there, waiting to be discovered. I wonder if anyone will ever find it. If they do, will they understand? This nobody knows, but at the bottom of one of the hundreds of buildings that my master built rests hidden the center of the universe. Thank you.
Right, so the collection, the cartographer tries to map away to Zion. It imagines a conversation between, as Ted was telling you, it imagines a conversation between a Rastaman and a cartographer. It's a very contentious conversation. But I'm not going to give you a real sense of that conversation. I'm just going to select about 4 or 5 poems that I think begin to talk about the politics of travel in its own way. And then that'll probably be part of what I'll be talking about, or what we'll be talking about together. But this is the poem that comes right before the sequence starts. It's a short poem, it's called What the Map Maker Ought to Know. On this island, things fidget, even history. The landscape does not sit willingly as if behind an easel, holding pose, waiting on someone to pencil its lines, compose its best features or unruly contours. Here, landmarks shift. They become unfixed by earthquake, by landslide, by utter spite. Whole places will slip out from your grip. This is like 9 in the sequence, in which the cartographer travels lengths and breadths. Give him time, and he will learn the strange ways and names of this island, the clapping ascent to Baptist, the thankful that takes you up Grateful Hill, just round the corner from Content will know, the rough and proud to boldness and blackness, the painful chains to bad times, the long and short to 3 miles, 6 miles, 9 miles, 11 miles, whose distances incidentally are not related to each other. He'll know the haunting that takes you through Duppygate, the slow that goes to wait a bit, the correct etiquette to a compound, even to Minosen Yunocom. Will know the grunting path to Hoghole, the struggle required for effort, the pothole roads to Shambles, Rat Trap and put together corner as well. The cartographer will know places named after places, how this island spreads itself out as a palimpsest of maps, for here is Bethlehem, here is Tel Aviv, here is Gaza, also Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Egypt, Cairo, and here is Bengal, Mount Horeb, Albion, Alps. They say all of here is Babylon. This is 12 and 13. By the way, if you go to Jamaica and you, as a tourist, very likely one of the popular places in which a resort would be built is on an old plantation, or an old great house will be just kind of refitted out as a hotel, which seems very strange to me. It's kind of like imagining building a 5-star hotel out of a gas chamber. Right? It's just kind of weird, isn't it? So great houses always make me feel weird. So in the collection, the Rastaman is taking the cartographer around and they end up at a great house. Jeremy Paxman says of this collection, he praises it because I'm supposedly speaking to regular people and not poets. And I am. But if you listen very carefully, there's all kinds of ways in which I'm talking about the iambic pentameter as well, and critiquing it. But anyway, there's just one reference here that, so if you go to Jamaica and you go to Rose Hall Great House, which is a hotel, you'll see an amazing, the horizon looks amazing, and that's a great view. But I also make reference to a folktale in Jamaica. It's where Anansi, the trickster spider, he steals a magic pot in a time of famine. He uses it to feed himself, but he doesn't feed his family. When his wife discovers the pot, she's so happy that she's a clean woman that she washes the pot and it washes away the magic. That's the reference that's in there. Anyway, 12, in which the Rasta man begins to feel uncomfortable. So wide is the horizon, as seen from the flung open windows of Rose Hall Great House, that one can observe the clear curve of the earth. For the cartographer, the sea becomes a glittering parabola, an arc of shining measure. But for the Rastaman, it is the upturned Dutch pot, the one unwittingly shined by Anansi's wife, a silver tale of greed in the midst of famine, the tragic full-up of big men's belly, the washway of small people's magic. 13. You see, the Rastaman has always felt uneasy in the glittering white splendor of great houses, uneasy with the way others seem easy inside them, their eyes that smoothly scan the green cane fields like sonnets, as if they'd found a measure of peace in the brutal architecture of history. And the last one I'll read is a strange poem. In 1992, a ship was sailing from China to America with cargo, and the cargo overturned, and into the sea there ended up being 28,000 rubber ducks. And like they're actually still out there now, which is fucking amazing. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Which is amazing. Just beat that, please. But I thought how these ducks end up being cartographers in their own way, just going all around the earth, and scientists really do track the movements of these ducks. In a way, I kind of wanted to write a poem about the Middle Passage without seeming to be writing a poem about the Middle Passage. Anyway, when considering the long journey of 28,000 rubber ducks, to them who knew to break free from dark hold of ships, who trusted their unsqueezed bodies instead to the Atlantic, to them who scorned the limits of bathtubs, refused to join a course of rub-a-dub, to them who've always known their own high tunes, hitched rides on the manacled backs of blues, who've been sailing now since 1992, to them that pass in squeakless silence over the Titanic, who float in and out of salty vortexes, to them who grace the shores of hot and frozen continents, who instruct us yearly on the movement of currents, to those bright yellow dots that crest the waves like spots of praise. Hail. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for those readings. Kai, the reason I really wanted you to read that last poem is because I think, to me, it sums up, or it captures the spirit of travel when you say scorn the limits of bathtubs. I mean, we're all essentially domestic creatures. We all have our domestic habits, and one of the things about travel is it actually gets us out from those spaces. And you talked about it being about the Middle Passage. But is that what sort of captured your imagination about the ducks, that there's something kind of intrepid about them in their unsqueaked holes?
Is that what? Oh, hello. Yeah, there is. I don't know. It's kind of a mixture. I don't know if I hold to the easy view that travel is about expanding ourselves. Though I don't know what opinion I'm coming to, but I think for me travel is about finding out how small the world is rather than how large the world is. And it's kind of discovering that I think there are two ways of traveling. You can travel and you can think that everywhere you go is going to be exceptional, or you can travel thinking that everywhere is going to be relational. And I think that's what you discover very quickly, that places are not exotic, that every place is absolutely banal to the people who live there every day. And part of your responsibility is to find the banality of it, which is because our own lives are banal. I mean, and it's finding how it is life, how it is actual life to those people, and so in a way it's probably the opposite of what you're saying. It's more discovering that we pretend to scorn the limits of bathtubs, but we never really do, and it's finding out how everywhere is a small place in a way.
I just want to bring in a little on banality, because actually there's something about distance, in a way, from a city, like a distance from a city like Istanbul, which you come back to a lot, that can bring you closer to it in a sort of paradoxical way, isn't there? And do you find that distance kind of removes you from the banality of Istanbul life, or does it sort of enliven it? Does it make it? Does it breathe fresh life into it for you?
I mean, the word distance has a negative connotation for many people, but I think it has a positive impact in our lives, particularly for writers, storytellers, artists. You need some distance, you know? But how far, that's a question mark. So I've always believed that there's a threshold. Maybe you need to be on the periphery of the society, of any society. You need to be enough of an insider, but enough of an outsider at the same time. And that position is a very lonely position. You feel very alone there, but at the same time, paradoxically, you feel connected to so many people, you know, countless people from all backgrounds. All my life has been quite nomadic. At the beginning, this wasn't my choice. This was the life I was born into. Over time, it became a choice. And just following up on what you've earlier said, I do believe that there are two ways of traveling too. Perhaps in the first way, where you're going to end up, you know, where you're going to arrive is the main thing that really matters. But for other people, just to be, you know, just to keep moving. Not the destiny, you know, not the destination, but just the act of constantly moving spiritually, physically, intellectually, being on the move is much more important and addictive almost. And this is something that I find very difficult to explain, and that's a much more nomadic existence. It's different than the life of an immigrant, where you move somewhere perhaps and you decide you've settled down. For people who are intellectually nomads, everywhere is equally foreign, and every foreign land is equally home, you know?
Do you share Kai's sense of responsibility to, when you go to a new place, to see it as a local, as to see it with all of its humdrum qualities as well as the...
Isn't it always like that when we get out of our own neighborhood, and then when we come back after a certain time, we start to notice the details that we failed to see in the first place, because we often take it for granted, you know, the life we live, the neighborhoods, the trees, the details. But I think it oftentimes takes a foreigner or an outsider or a latecomer to notice those details. I've met lots of foreign journalists who observe life in Istanbul much better than us Istanbulites, because you have a child's curiosity when you're a foreigner. You allow yourself to ask questions, and oftentimes natives don't do that because there's no time. Why the need? You just take it for granted. That curiosity is very important.
You write in that beautiful passage that Istanbul is a city of easy forgettings, and I love that idea of a city being amnesiac about itself. Do you feel that it's a novelist's role to sort of remember what the city's forgotten in a way?
Yes, I do believe that as human beings, you know, in our lives, both memory and forgetting is necessary. However, in Turkey we have gone to one extreme, and that extreme is amnesia. So there's a lot of collective amnesia. Istanbul is really a city of forgetting, so we're constantly erasing the past, even though it's a very old city, very ancient city, layered, multi-layered, story upon story, history upon history. But we have no records. So when you go to places like Berlin or London, I can't help but compare that there's a lot of urban memories scattered throughout London. Maybe these are tiny things, but they matter to me. When I walk by a house and it says so-and-so lived in this house, the first, female politician, or the first, female doctor, or you walk by a pub and it says George Orwell used to drink here. I love that. We have no such signs, no, visible urban memory. You have to find it out as the writer. You have to dig it up and bring it to the surface of the earth.
It's still in flux in a way, and actually that's something that comes up a lot in your collection, Kai. In the first poem that you read, there's this wonderful line, "On this island things fidget." I like that idea that identity is fidgeting, that buildings are fidgeting, that everything is moving, and there's this image in the poem of a kind of slightly unruly subject for a portrait who won't sit still. Is that one of the things that perhaps we settle into a perception of a place, but actually the closer we look, it's never sitting still?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of what Elif is saying, that there is, the writer's responsibility is to see more, is to train yourself how to see things, how to see what hasn't been seen. And it's absolutely right that there are people who will come into a place. You see, I guess I come from the kind of place where people, well, both things are true. Jamaica is a place where people travel to. It belongs to that category of the world. You're writing world literature. It's where world music is created. That category is always strange to me. But it's part of that thing about the world. And therefore I think it's often seen through the eyes of the traveler. And that's one of the things that worries me sometimes. It's not only what do you see, but how do you see it? And just to give you a strange, banal example, when I was teaching in Jamaica some time ago, university students, I once asked them how would they describe Jamaica, and at least 4 of my students said exotic. And that's bizarrely worrying, that they'd lived their whole lives in Jamaica. Some of them had never traveled, and the only way, the word that came naturally to mind was exotic, and it meant they could only see their country through someone else's eyes. They couldn't see it through their own eyes. And that's why I feel a weird responsibility that yes, a traveler will see something, but does that become the only way of seeing the place? Do locals buy into that way of seeing a place? So what are the politics of seeing? What are the politics of a gaze? When does a gaze fix a place in a problematic place? That you can't escape, and so I think seeing is a very it's something that troubles me a lot. What do I see? How do I see it? How do I give that vision? And so probably that's what I want to at the very beginning of that collection. I want to problematize what seeing is. I want to destabilize the view and make it fidget, make it not stand still. So we can see different things at different times.
Your work's very visual as well. Do you share that kind of desire to want to try and show things in flux?
Absolutely, and it so much resonates with me, everything you're saying. The gaze, of course, can be very authoritarian. It can be part of a hegemony, can't it? It troubles me as well. One of my earlier novels is called The Gaze, and it's the story of an extremely tall and fat woman and a dwarf who are in love with each other, and they can never walk hand in hand on the streets of Istanbul. It's a very it's like stories within stories, but the central theme is the gaze, and I wanted to deal with this idea of the gaze of God always watching you, never blinking, as a celestial gaze, the gaze of the society never allowing you to be different, and if you are different because of your the color of your skin, the way you dress, because of your gender, whatever, judging you with their gaze. The gaze of the lover, the gaze of tradition. So there's a lot of that, a lot of pressure on each and every one of us. And there's always, it very much punishes difference. It's not the gaze never celebrates, the authoritarian gaze never celebrates diversity, never celebrates differences. So these are things that trouble me. And I think every storyteller wants to look at the truth from different angles. That's what intrigues me. For me, story writing is not necessarily an autobiographical pursuit. I know many people believe that, whatever we write, there's an autobiographical echo in it. Of course, that's true up to a certain extent. But what intrigues me much more as a writer is not being myself. That's how I started writing at the beginning. I thought my life was very boring and I just wanted to be someone else. You can't do that in your daily life, but when you're writing, you can be the other and the other of the other and the other of the other. So that journey, that almost spiritual, existential journey, is something that I love passionately.
And you've spoken about the desire to want to break out of cultural ghettos. That reminded me of your book, 40 Rules of Love, and the way that there's a sort of Minnesotan housewife who discovers the poet Rumi and has this, from within a very domestic arrangement, has this extraordinary spiritual and poetic journey into Sufi poetry. And that's something that it just comes across in your work in a way that you don't want to sort of show, even from an external point of view. You could say that she was living in a cultural ghetto, but the novel can do that. It can sort of show you how there are these wormholes through which we can go into other cultures.
Yes, I sincerely believe, art, of course, in general does that to us, but particularly perhaps the genre of the novel. Why do I believe in that? Because it's a very lonely form of art. I mean, the writer is alone when she or he is writing, and the reader is alone when he or she is reading. Many forms of art can be consumed collectively, like a concert, exhibitions and many other things. But when we're reading novels, we retreat into an inner space. So within the inner space, we build a connection. I believe human beings are always inclined much more towards totalitarianism, towards fascistic thoughts when they are together with other people. Fascism is a collectivistic disease. I have met lots of homophobic readers in Turkey who utter lots of homophobic remarks when they're in the company of their friends, but when they're alone and when they're reading a novel, they connect with that gay character and they even love that character. I have lots of xenophobic readers who, again, utter lots of bigotry in their daily life, but when they're reading a novel, they connect with the Armenian character, Jewish character, because they can feel it. So that's what the novel does in our inner space. I think when we are lonely, it opens up the possibility of pulling us out of our mental ghettos.
It's really interesting. Kei, I want to ask you about, we've talked a bit about visualizing and the visual importance in the work. I also want to ask you about the kind of acoustic properties of the book, because actually you mentioned earlier on that you're kind of teasing with iambic pentameter. That might seem like a sort of poetic, geeky thing to be talking about, but actually I think it's really interesting because it is about nudging British poetry a bit and sort of testing the rhythms of it, because there's a slightly different rhythm that you're introducing there, and that seems like, could you talk a little bit about what you were trying to do, what you set out to do on that?
It comes to the fore in one of the poems. It's so one of the things that fascinated me, and yes, this is probably absolutely geeky, but don't worry, it's not overwhelming in the collection. You can read it and not know that's what I'm doing, and you'll be fine. I swear. But it fascinated me growing up that in Rastafari, what you'd probably call a one-drop rhythm. It's not really one drop, but think of any Bob Marley song, or just if you can think of a Rastafari beat. In Jamaica, you call it a heartbeat rhythm, and there's just something of the. But when I was in school, and we learned about the iambic pentameter, they said that the iambic pentameter was the most natural rhythm because it was the rhythm of the heart. And that was just amazing to me, that there are these two rhythms so, profoundly different, that both of them are claiming the province of the heart. Both of them are claiming to be natural and instinctive because they belong to the heart. Both the Rasta rhythm and the iambic pentameter. And I wanted to bring those two rhythms together. And there was going to be dissonance. There would naturally be dissonance in them. So that's part of what the collection is doing. That a lot of the cartographers' works, they just lapse naturally into iambic pentameter. But the Rastaman's poems, they're often on the kind of Rastafari heartbeat rhythm. And I guess that's just another way of exploring places, that places have different sounds. And what sound do you privilege? What sound can exist on the page? And so I absolutely wanted that. Part of how the cartographer travels through Jamaica is that he's eventually seduced by another rhythm, by another sound, and that sound, when he understands that sound, is when he truly understands the place he's in. And so sound as a way of travel was important to me.
That's really interesting. It's also about what kind of knowledge arises through the heart. You know, I love that idea of a heartbeat rhythm being a competing. We all have our hearts that operate more or less the same way, but that we can interpret them in different ways. And that I think, Elif, in the passage that you read, there's also this exploration of what kind of knowledge comes through the heart and what kind of knowledge comes rationally. And actually, that can also be an interesting phenomenon when you visit a place. That you can have an emotional response to it that's kind of not connected to its rational being. Do you? That's something else the photographer says at one point. He says, "I never fall in love." He says, it's not something that happens to me. But there's this rational perspective on it.
Right. Complete lie.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about your work, and I just want to open it up and talk about your actual travels and where you've been to. You're both living more or less in the UK at the moment. I think you're back and forth to Istanbul. But do you feel a sense of belonging here in the UK? Has that started to take root?
Yes, it did. I mean, it has started after 4 years in London, and I know it sounds like a cliche, but it matters to me that London is so cosmopolitan, so multicultural. Again, in Istanbul, of course, it's a diverse society, it's a diverse city, but we have lost that cosmopolitan heritage, and I believe by losing that, we have lost a lot. And I'm not talking about a financial loss or anything like that. Deeper, much deeper in our hearts, we've lost a lot, and now maybe we are learning to regain that. But I wish we had appreciated that ethnic, religious diversity, linguistic diversity much more in the past. We haven't done that. So London, you feel very free as an outsider, as a woman. It matters to me that, I know these are small things, but they're important in an individual's life, that you can walk around on the streets, comfortably. In many places, I do travel a lot. Since my childhood, I've been in many, many different cities, and particularly today in the Middle East, one of the things that worries me is this loss of balance between masculine energy and feminine energy. I think many of our cities, many of our big towns, you see this very visible masculine energy on the streets, in the squares, everywhere, and the feminine energy is oftentimes confined to the private space, to the space of family. We need to bring more women into the public space. That loss of balance is something that troubles me a lot.
You described Istanbul as a she city, and London would be...
London for me is a hermaphrodite. It has both genders, masculinity and femininity, both of them very visible in my eyes. Istanbul, yes, is a she city. It's interesting when you look at the writings of the Ottoman poets for 600 centuries. Many Ottoman poets saw Istanbul as, and they have this interesting definition. They called her a widow who had married maybe 400 times and was still a virgin and had killed all her husbands, and she was still, strong and had survived all of them. That was their description of Istanbul. London, for me, has both masculinity and femininity, and it is a city in which you can see historical continuity as well.
Do you see cities as gendered? They're cities that you felt were very masculine or feminine?
I don't know, no, cities don't strike me as strange. But I mean, I'll tell you what it's meant to move to London recently. Which this is being taped, isn't it?
I'm afraid so. Yeah. Chatham House rules, kind of.
Yeah. But I will say it's been. But one of the things that strikes me as extraordinary, I think there is because so much starts with London, because of the fact of empire. I think there is a way of thinking of some cities. To think of a city like Kingston as and any city on the periphery of empire as a way in which they were trying to remember London, and it's London reimagined, or perhaps London imagined insufficiently. That's what happens in perhaps Lagos. It's what's happened in Kingston. It's what happens in Delhi. It's always it's the nostalgia of the colonizer who is trying to remember his city, and he remembers it insufficiently. And that's kind of fascinating. It's the way that you go around and everywhere has a King Street, everywhere has a Victoria Park. It's all of these ways in which they were trying to remember London, and no place could ever be London. And then you come back to a place like Brixton, which I've moved to now, and you realize that in a strange way what's happened is that Brixton is Kingston insufficiently imagined. And so what happens is that it's London returned to itself in a weird kind of refraction, and that's just fascinating to live through that, to see how London both exported itself and then came back to itself, and what are the kinds of collisions that happen. And so it's been very just fascinating to live in that area right now, and just to think about how cities imagine themselves and reimagine themselves, how they go out and return to themselves, and there's a lot I want to write about that. There's a lot more thinking I have to do through it. But that's been fascinating just to see that. I mean, the first night I woke up in London, right underneath my window, there's an argument going on, and someone said, "Yo, move your bumper clot." And someone said, "Oh, the Ross clot, yeah, that." And I really wanted to shout out my own clot and add to this discussion. And it felt like I was moving back to the Caribbean. It was great.
I guess that London has the whole world in it. It seems to sort of gathered, as you say, refracted the whole world. What other cities have you travelled to that you felt that have had a particular impact on you? I know you've been to Iraq recently in British Council. What was that like?
I mean, I'm absolutely not saying this to curry favour. The only city I would have moved to, if not London, was Manchester. I mean, I swear to God, and I was looking desperately for a job in Manchester, but then happened, "Hey guys, if you want to hire me." So in a strange way, I've always talked about this. I don't know why I connect so much to Manchester more than any place. So of all the places I've been to, Manchester has always been really important. And so when I was looking for a job, I thought, okay, if I couldn't get a job in Manchester, then I'd move to London, which is, just almost as good. But again, so a place like Iraq, again, it's that thing that struck me of a place being relational rather than exceptional. I mean, of course, you tell your friends, I'm going to go to Iraq. Your friends in Jamaica, I mean, what do you think they're going to say? Why the hell? Who the holy hell would willingly go on a plane and say, "Hey, yeah, I'm going to Iraq"? Why are you going to Iraq? To give a reading, as one does. And as soon as I landed there, I mean, one of my favorite landscapes in the world is the Middle East. I love Egypt. I love Israel. Just that landscape has always energized me in a way. And there was something about landing in Iraq where immediately everything was familiar. And I thought, oh, it stopped being exceptional. It was just the Middle East. It was a landscape that I actually knew, that I'd visited already. And that's probably what struck me more than anything else, how immediately when you are in a place, it stops being that kind of shocking. It was just normal life. I mean, ISIS didn't start happening. I left Egypt and then the whole riot started. I left Iraq, and then ISIS started.
It's your fault, Kai.
So I take some responsibility.
But it is that thing of life carrying on as well.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the thing you mentioned earlier about that actually these are places who they're in the headlines a lot, but there is a way in which they continue and that people go to school. And
Yeah, and I think there's that responsibility to find out how this is everyday life, how there's a banality, and I don't mean that in a bad way. And in this, by the way, I'm quoting when I was an undergraduate, and never graduated from it. But when I was an undergraduate, there was a book I read by Jamaica Kincaid, A Small Place, and she said very eloquently, she said the problem of tourism is, she said everyone lives a life of crushing banality, and the problem with the tourists is that they have the money to transform someone's banality into a source of pleasure for themselves. And that's why it's how you begin to consume a landscape. And very early I just thought that must never be the way that I interact with a place, that because I have the money of the tourists that I can begin to consume it. And I shouldn't transform that place into a source of pleasure if it's not a source of pleasure for the people in that place. And I don't know how to do that, but I think that's always in the back of my mind.
there's also that phenomenon of disaster tourism. You heard about this, where people go and take selfies in front of disasters.
Yeah.
It's absolutely bonkers, but we're not advocating that. So, Elif, what's it? We mentioned Manchester earlier, and you were saying you're a big punk fan, and so this is a city that has, you're excited to come and walk up and down the music venues up here. Would you consider moving to Manchester?
Why not? But isn't it interesting? I mean, as we go from one city to another, our body language changes so much. I think that also happens as we commute between languages. Our voices change, the intonation changes without being aware of it. In places like Istanbul, Cairo, you get used to walking with masses, with crowds. The rhythm is very different on the streets. This flow of the crowds. Yes. I observe that in myself, in other people. Because I'm usually a calmer person in my daily life, sometimes my readers think I listen to very soft music when I'm writing, but coming back to your question, It's just the opposite. I listen to very angry music. I love it, the high energy, so I listen to punk, post-punk, psychedelic and industrial metal and things like that. So Manchester is important. No, I don't headbang, but I feel connected to that energy. And the loop, cycles is very important. So when I like a song, I listen to it maybe 200 times, again and again and again. It's like a mystical,
You mentioned different languages, and you write in Turkish and English. And could you talk a little bit about what inhabiting those different languages does? Is it like entering a different landscape?
Absolutely, I do believe that. Each language is a different zone of existence, and you experience a different kind of freedom as you move into a new language or as you commute between different languages. It is hard, on the one hand, it's a challenge, and it can be very intimidating as well, because when you're a foreigner, there's a part of you who, that listens and judges, and it's in a way like, your brain runs faster than your tongue, and your tongue is trying to catch up. There's always this gap between the two, and you're very much aware of that. So when I listen to my children, for instance, they're always making fun of my mispronunciation. They catch those gaps immediately. You're also aware of those. But those gaps can be also very rewarding. They can be very stimulating, because they help you to pay more attention to words, to letters, particularly for people who love languages, the way we do as poets and writers. It can be very rewarding. I do believe that this is the century of people who dream in more than one language. More and more people somehow dream in several languages at night. And if we can dream in more than one language, we can write fiction in more than one language. I have been, for the last 12 years, writing in English first. Each novel is being translated into Turkish by a professional translator. Then I take it and I rewrite it. So it's a bit insane. You spend a lot of time for each novel, but I just love that commute back and forth. And I realized over time that there are things I prefer to say in Turkish first. So if there's melancholy in it, if there's more sorrow in it, it comes easier. It's much easier in Turkish. But humor, irony, satire much easier in English.
Yes, just remind me of the line in your first book. The first book was translated A Bus of Istanbul, which to walk in Istanbul is to walk with the crowd. And I like that idea that everywhere you walk, you're in a collective, and that it's a kind of hive mind almost. Party.
And I think that, you know, the imagery is also, it can be used as a political metaphor because it's a very collectivistic society. There isn't much room for individuality. Individuality is not encouraged. And to me, that's important to
encourage that here. Maybe we should open up for some questions. If people have any questions. Oh yeah, great.
Just shout, yeah.
Is there a microphone?
Don't need a mic, I'm very loud.
There we go.
I don't know what the position is in Jamaica, so apologies, but in Turkey there's obviously been, over recent years, great threats to writers and journalists. It's become a more and more dangerous country for writers and journalists. And apologies, I can't comment on Jamaica because I don't know, but the question for both of you. Do you see any sort of hope in the future, given the current situation in a country like Turkey?
So I just need to repeat it for the recording. Sorry, you were very clear. But so the question is there? Do you see? There's a lot of pressure on freedom of expression, and do you think that might change in Turkey and in Jamaica in the future?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, particularly over the last years, I think it's been quite heartbreaking to see how, particularly in the media, I think Turkish media visibly shrunk. Diversities, you know, there's much less diversity than used to be in the past. The society is very polarized, and I think that's very unhealthy for any country. And the media is also very polarized. People, again, who want to be individuals, who want to perhaps connect different groups, bridge, such people can't survive for very long. You know, they choose sides, and it's always very black and white, which troubles me. In the Press Freedom Index, Turkey went back. To be honest, I mean, I think for every journalist, every poet, every writer in Turkey knows that because of your words, you might get into trouble. And we always write, we always produce with that knowledge somewhere at the back of our minds. And I wouldn't believe anyone who tells you that there is no self-censorship, that they're 100% free to write whatever they want. But self-censorship is a very difficult subject to talk about. You know, because it also means we have to recognize how we control ourselves. And I'm not only talking about political issues, but sexual issues as well. I think for women writers particularly, it's a big challenge. So there are sexual taboos in addition to political taboos. A couple of things are happening in Turkey. Just to wrap it up very, very briefly, Turkey is a very complicated country. In my opinion, it's incredibly complex. There's always hope, definitely. The youth, the women, the minorities, you know, beautiful people, beautiful land. But of course, lots of things are very, very frustrating. One of our greatest poets, Nazım Hikmet, in one of his letters to his wife, he says he had to live in exile for many long years. He suffered a lot because of the authoritarian political regime. And in one of his letters, he says, you know, my country, I love you, I miss you, and I'm so angry at you. And there's a part of me that understands that anger, because you feel so frustrated that we can't make progress, that we can't go forward. Again and again, we are making those mistakes, that we learn nothing from the mistakes of the past. And that's really frustrating in Turkey. And yet at the same time, when you look at the social media, young people, because the more the media shrunk in Turkey, the more politicized the social media became, you know. So there's a lot of dynamism, energy out there. It's not a quiet civil society at all. People are talking, people are questioning major issues. So you can be both very pessimistic and very optimistic when you take a closer look at Turkey.
In the case of Jamaica, you're probably right to direct that question over there. Again, in every way it's complicated. Jamaica always scores extremely high on Press Freedom Index. I mean, extremely high. and that comes with its own problems. There is definitely freedom of speech without responsibility of that free speech. And it means, for instance, over the past year and a half, there's been one newspaper in Jamaica in particular, the Jamaica Observer, which is one of the major newspapers that the stories have been there's obviously a kind of campaign to promote Jamaican homophobia and Jamaican bigotry. And there is no kind of response. So some weeks they just make up stories. And it's the homosexual gunmen who are terrorizing whole neighborhoods. And you know, the all Jamaicans say, oh my God, they're carrying guns now. We really have to crack down on those homosexual bandits. You know, you can laugh about it, but it really is ridiculous, and it's such obvious fear-mongering. And in anywhere else in the world, there would have been other kinds of rules about hate speech that would have limited that kind of freedom. But in Jamaica, there's a kind of freedom that instead of promoting equality, actually reinscribes a kind of bigotry. And that's a weird thing.
Questions? If there's a pause, this might be a good moment to talk about our artifacts, because I've asked Elif and Kei to bring with them things that have stories behind them from their travels. So Elif, do you want to talk us through what have you brought?
Yes, So I brought a letter with me, and this is in Turkish. It's a Turkish letter. It's one of the letters in the Turkish alphabet that does not exist in the English alphabet. It's called the silent G. It's a phantom letter, a ghost letter. You say it, but you never read it aloud. There are no words in the Turkish language that can start with this letter. It can be in the middle, rarely at the end of a word, but never at the beginning. And I have a special love attachment, I guess, for this letter. And the story is very briefly, when I was born as a child, I was left-handed. And when I started school, my class teacher, with all the good intentions, because that was the norm at the time, made sure that I became right-handed. They thought there was something wrong with, being left-handed. And as a result, it was very difficult for me to write. I learned how to read very quickly. I was very eager to learn how to read, but when it came to writing, I found it very difficult. And I was, I believe, the last or one of the last children in the classroom to learn how to write and wear a red ribbon, proudly. The silent G helped me a lot. Somehow, I couldn't make the other letters, but this letter, I found it very easy to draw with my right hand. Somehow it became my gate into the alphabet, my gate into the written culture, the world of books and the world of writing. So I love it dearly, and the fact that it's both absent and present, both a threshold letter, both inside and out. It has a symbolic value for me as well.
Yeah. But what's the artifact?
It's the letter itself.
Okay.
But is it also connected to your ring? Is that also the story?
The ring is a symbol that's used by the Sufis. Silence was very important for them, and it's a concept that troubles me a little bit because I don't find silence very easy. I don't like silence when I'm writing. I always write with music, with noise. If I'm in Istanbul, I open the windows and let the noise of the city pour in. Yeah. So I'm not someone who's very comfortable with silence. But this symbol of the whirling dervishes. Right. It's about renewal, continuity, transcendence, but also silence, the importance of silence, and the silent G. These are things that are connected in my life, in my mind, and I guess in my personal story.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm wearing a magician's glove at the moment. You may have noticed, and that's because in a moment I have to pick something up that's very precious. But it's not because I'm just going to do a magic trick.
I'm glad he said magic, because that just looked weirdly kinky and actually. No choice.
It's just a ruse, right?
So the item I bought is just, it's just this bag, which I was pressured into buying. And there are a few times when I feel pressured into buying. So this I got in Egypt.
It's very nice.
Yeah, it is very nice. Thanks. But Egypt, I remember being a hard experience. You know, I think again because Jamaica is a place that people always go as tourists. You know, one of the rules that you always say is like, please don't harass the tourists, because if you land in Jamaica, they will run out. They'll ask you to buy this, buy that. So when someone said, "Oh, you're going to Egypt, be prepared, because they are going to harass you," and I thought, dude, I come from Jamaica. I was so not prepared. I mean, that was on another level. And there's so many experiences. I remember once walking like almost a mile, honest to God, a mile up the road, and 3 boys were just kind of walking behind me, and they said, please sir, give us some money. And I said, no. They said, please sir, give us some money. No. Please sir, give 1 mile. Please sir, give, no! And I tried different modulations, no. And it would not work. And almost a mile up the road, I remember that this friend who was trying to warn me said, you need to know that the Arabic word for it. So finally they said, please sir, can you give us some money? And I said, la! And they backed off. And one of them actually turned to the other 2 boys and he said, look what you did. You made him say la. You never know when to stop. And I don't know why saying no in that language made a difference, because they're clearly bilingual. But another story was walking another day, and you've heard all my politics about, you know, how to interact responsibly with the culture. Another day I was walking and a guy kept on saying, please sir, buy something from here. And I kept on saying no. And he just looked at me in scorn and he said, you are a bad tourist. And I accepted that rebuke. I accepted that you expect me to buy something, and that is supposed to be my reaction, and I apologize, and so I bought this from you.
I'm just very quickly going to show you something, an artifact from our special guest Anthony Burgess, who he collected matchbooks, and actually this matchbook here, which I'm holding in my kinky gloved hand, is from the Grand Seine, and that is actually appears in this novel, Earthly Powers. And it's just this interesting thing of an actual object being in a book that I can read from very briefly. But he says, I toyed once with the notion of a travel book arranged on the aleatory taking out of matchbooks from this bowl, rather like filthy Norman Douglas's autobiography based on the random selection of visiting cards. We won't talk about Norman Douglas's filthy visiting cards. But anyway, it's just an interesting thing that this particular beautiful purple, I'm not sure if you can see it in the light, matchbook, made its way into this very novel. We're running quite short of time, so I think we just have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So yeah, go ahead.
Can I just start?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Egypt's come up quite a few times. I'm Egyptian.
Okay.
So, but I was born and bred in London. But I spent 4 years in Cairo with the British Council, ironically, from 2009 to 2013. So I was there when the outbreak of protests and the sort of post-revolutionary period afterwards. We talked a lot about tourism and also about identity. And actually, from my experience as being an Egyptian but being born and bred in London, Arabic being my second language, and I would say Egyptian colloquial Arabic being my third language. As soon as when I arrived to Cairo, even though I've been there 3 or 4 times every single year for pretty much my entire childhood, when I finally moved there and actually started speaking the language, it was always in my head because I spoke Arabic with my parents, spoke Egyptian Arabic with my parents. But actually sitting there every single day at work with taxis at shop owners speaking Egyptian colloquial Arabic, I went from being a tourist, because I genuinely felt like a tourist in my own country, even though I looked Egyptian. Everyone always addressed me in Arabic. I never had anyone asking me to buy something because I looked Egyptian. But as soon as I opened my mouth, they would get the letters, the vowels, the accent straight away and say, you're Egyptian, there's something's off here. And I would become a tourist.
Wow.
Even though my name's Ahmed, I look Egyptian, and the whole heritage is Egyptian. But when after about a year, maybe a year and a bit, and my Egyptian Arabic was pretty good, that all disappeared. And no longer was I looked at as Ahmed with the duality of being a British national, because Ahmed the Egyptian. And I think I was able to see something else that I hadn't seen in the previous year. My question to both of you is, you both obviously have a lot of duality, probably more to it than that. You're living in London, Turkey, Jamaica before that, other places. Do you find that in your respective nationalities, going back to Turkey, going back to Jamaica, that something else has changed in you, and do people look at you differently as well because they are aware of your duality?
What a beautiful question. It's definitely, yes, I can recognize, I can connect to what you're saying. As a matter of fact, I experienced that when I was a teenager. I spent part of my childhood in Madrid, Spain, and when I came back to Turkey, not that I had forgotten my Turkish, it was very intense, I have to tell you. During those 4 years, I was constantly speaking Spanish and English and very little Turkish. So when I came back, of course, I hadn't forgotten my Turkish. But what had happened was, while I was away, the language had been moving, had been growing. You realize languages are alive, they're breathing, they're organic. So when I came back, I could not follow the new slang, the new idioms, and I had to buy notebooks and start working, studying Turkish, which helped me so much. At the time, I found it very difficult because people were making fun of me. If I couldn't get a joke or a slang word, of course, they ridicule you. But in the long run, it helps so much because you start studying your mother tongue as if it were a foreign tongue. And I think we must all be studying our mother tongues, You must be paying attention. In Turkey, this helped me a lot because, as you might know, the Turkish language also went through a political transformation. When the new nation state was established, the language was Turkified. And I'm very critical of this. I don't approve of this. Lots of words that used to come from Arabic and Persian origin were taken out of the language in the name of purity. So when you look at an Ottoman dictionary, it is this thick. When you look at a modern Turkish dictionary, it is this thick. About 58% of words were lost, gone. So I can say yellow in Turkish, I can say red in Turkish, but I can't say the shades in between because they used to come from Persian. And as a writer, I long for those nuances. So when you lose your touch a little bit with your mother tongue, maybe your accent changes, as in your case, or you lose contact with the organic expansion of the language, as in my case, in the long run, that can be very helpful because you start to pay more attention to nuance. I believe.
Probably slightly different for me. It's because probably both are very engaged in our respective countries still, and in the kind of space of social media. So I blog a lot about Jamaica, very contentious things apparently. So they say. I get hate mail. But I think in order to speak with any authority about Jamaica, they're always looking for a way to say you don't really know, you're not from here, you've gone to the first world, blah. So this will sound incredible, but lots of people in Jamaica don't know that I don't live in Jamaica. I go there at least 3 times a year.
Let's hope they're not watching then.
Yeah, let's hope they're not watching. But yeah, there are all kinds of. And I definitely feel that. But it's always there's always this weird accusation that if you're not here every single day, you have no authority. And I think it's just it's a weird political game you have to play in order to speak with authority about that place which you care so much about. But it would be too much to go into all the ways in which you play that game.
I really related to your story actually about being Egyptian and then going back, and I wanted to pick up on your discussion about banality and getting into the skin of the country that you visit and trying to get to know what everyday life is like. And I recently had an experience when I was in Jordan last week that was really funny because I studied Arabic at university, but I'm not Arabic at all, and these little girls were following me when I was visiting a site, and they were like, hello miss, and they were so excited by the fact that they could speak English with me. And I turned around and I answered them in Arabic, and they immediately lost interest. Like, who's this person? They were like, oh, she's Arabic, okay, whatever. Moving on. And then the other thing you get is people trying to use you as a gateway. You know, they're so interested in you. What's the UK like? What's it like? And I was wondering what you say to people who ask you this question, what is the UK like? Do you find yourself falling back on stereotypes, or how do you explain that to people, you know? It's a really broad question and it's so hard to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That mean well, I guess that not thank God, but since I don't look like I'm from the UK, and worse when I had dreadlocks until 2 days ago, I'm so stereotypical Jamaican that I'd always get placed in Jamaica overseas. It's strangely the opposite question that annoys me. What's Jamaica like? How do you even start? But it's the same thing, you know. They're looking for something relational. They're asking, how is it different? And I can never come up with the answers for that.
Yeah. I think, I can understand that myself. We need to maybe keep the words plural as we can. So, you know, there isn't one Istanbul, there are Istanbuls. There isn't one London, there are Londons, you know. Depending on whom you talk to, where you go, you get a different picture. I prefer to remind people of that plurality wherever I go, and I think it's really necessary to do that, because without being aware of it, we make very easily sweeping generalizations. And particularly, not only women, of course, but just to give you an example, when you travel throughout the Middle East, I come across many women who say, oh, thank God I wasn't born over there. By over there, they mean the Western world as a big category, because they think if I were born over there, I would be reduced to a sexual entity. I wouldn't be respected as a woman. Where does that cliche come from, that stereotype come from? Many of them have not met European, you know, English women or American women in their lives, but they have a knowledge about how American women are. Or as you travel throughout America, you come across many women who say, oh, thank God I wasn't born over there. This time they're talking about the Middle East, because many of them think that had they been born in the Middle East, they would have no rights, and, you know, they would be very unhappy. Again, many people who say these things don't have Muslim or Jewish or Yazidi women friends who are born in the Middle East, but they have a knowledge. So where do all those stereotypes come from? From those sweeping generalizations that we make about the other place, the other culture. That's why I think as writers, as journalists, as poets, we need to keep the words as plural, multiple as we can, and constantly incorporate nuances, you know, and multiplicity into every discourse wherever we go.
I think we just have time for one more question.
Yeah, it's come back as a common theme throughout the conversation, particularly the inside and outside of Egypt. And it goes back to one of the first things I think you said, Elif, was that you have to be both an insider and an outsider to get to critical angle. How do you think you move towards that? Maybe if you don't feel both, if you're just inside, how do you think you get that critical angle?
Beautiful. I don't know if you would agree, but I think some level of compassion, love even, you know, I dare say, is necessary in order to understand. We can't understand very well without, you know, compassion and love being there, and empathy, of course. But then you also need the critical eye, and sometimes even anger. But we have to be careful with anger, because anger can become very poisonous. The beginning of anger is always very beautiful, but the middle and the end of anger is horrible. So where to stop with anger is very, very important. But we need a mixture of those feelings. I honestly believe traveling helps us. Traveling, you know, just leaving your space, your physical space for a few days, a few weeks, just leaving, coming back. Also, of course, books, you know, with books, stories, poems, novels, we do that all the time. They take us on journeys. But as often as we can, it pains me, especially in Turkey, when I come across particularly male readers who tell me, I don't have time for novels because I read serious things, you know, politics and history, because I want to learn as much as I can. They're missing that spiritual journey that novels offer. We need that in order to get out of our cocoons and to become someone else, at least for a few hours. All of these things help, I believe. But I've always believed that a mixture of compassion and criticism is necessary in order to understand a culture and the place.
Oh, we can keep going. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out. Yeah, sorry. I think we've got some time. Have we got some time? Yes, great. Okay.
Yeah, and it just kind of is freaky hearing someone give exactly the answer that I would have given and have given. That there is, I don't know, I mean, these metaphors outside and inside, I think they're helpful, but the minute we begin to think about them, what does that mean? And I think they're metaphors that help us a lot. But yeah, those distances, how do we achieve those distances? I'm never quite sure. Love is one of the words I keep on coming back to. And it's a weird word to come to, and it's a word that I put a lot of value in, and I think it's just unfortunate that there would be weird moments, and it's probably happened twice with a student who I think very highly of, that they'll ask me a question about writing, and I will always say, it seems the hokiest, most uncritical thing to say, but I honestly believe love is the most important thing. How we love the thing we're writing about, how we love the people we're critiquing, how we love that place, and that there's a kind of nearness. There's a way that distance is made shorter with love, and a way that I think you get on the inside, and that you are allowed, I think, to say very, very harsh things and very seemingly awful things, and you need that love is an incredible tool to use, especially if you're going to almost give it to someone. But I don't know. There's just no academic language with which to talk about the complexity of love and why love is a hugely important thing in writing. But I think there's something about writing that distance comes with it as well. This is a strange story. I remember just about 5 years ago, my mother died way too early, and I remember getting the call. The phone rang at 3 o'clock in the morning, and when the phone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning, the phone does not ring at that time for any other reason. And walking towards the phone, I just thought, shit, I'm going to pick up the phone, and I'm about to hear the news that my mother died. And then I thought, how am I going to react? But the weird thing is, I had immediately become a writer. Because I was observing myself. I observed myself waking up. I observed myself walking to the phone. I began to think, how am I going to react? And because I was thinking, how am I going to react, I didn't react because I thought any reaction would be false. And it was weird how, because I'd become a writer, I'd become so distant from the emotion that it took me 2 years to actually feel the emotion, because I was so conscious of everything I was doing that everything felt false. And so I think just the act of writing and the act of loving are things that bring distance and nearness at the same time.
Incredible. One of the things that, just to cut in briefly, I think love can also show us the unseen as well. One of the things in some of the poems that you read earlier, it can show us an unseen map. He said, the Rasta says at one point, you show me a map and I'll show you all the things that aren't on it. And there's that other realm that love can sort of guide us.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, come back on that, which is a pity, because you put it so beautifully. In countries where democracy is very wobbly, people tend to think that if you criticize the system, that you don't love your country, that you are an outsider. Very few people understand that because you love it, you criticize this much because you want it to be better. You don't want people, to make the mistakes that you observe. But there's very little tolerance, and many people think that, if you're criticizing, then you are the pawn of outside powers, that you are an outsider. There's all these conspiracy theories. They're incredibly widespread all throughout the Middle East. It's a pity that not many people understand this connection between love and criticism.
Question? Oh yeah, right at the back.
So it's a little bit connected to what you just said. Obviously, meaning is static. It depends what the source is, whose voice it comes in. So how much does that, particularly when talking about being more critical, how does that affect the way we write? things that you do love, but maybe don't want to give that singular view on.
Thank you. I think being a writer in Turkey is a bit like the moon. It has a dark side, it has a bright side. The dark side is because politics is so dominant, and clearly there isn't, when it comes to freedom of expression, we have huge problems. And again, as I said, because words can put you in trouble, there's a part of you that does worry about the consequences. The bright side is, again, where books are, in countries where books are not that free, strangely, paradoxically, books matter more. Stories matter, words matter, Their impact is perhaps larger. And I believe it's the same in India, in Pakistan. One book, one copy is read by 5-6 people. So people share the same copy. In Turkey, there's, when a reader reads a book, she sends it to her aunt. The aunt sends it back to her son in doing military service. And different people read the same book using different colored crayons or pens, and you see them underlining different sentences. People talk about books. So all of these things matter and hearten you, encourage you. One thing that helps me is when I'm in a story, I'm inside that story, I forget the so-called real world. And I stay in that world as long and as deep as I can. When the novel is over, when I hand it to my editor, then I start to worry what's going to happen, how are people going to react. But by then it's too late. The story is over. It's written. It has a different, independent existence. So while you're writing, I think you have to disconnect from the so-called real world as much as you can, because otherwise these worries inhibit us. We can't feel free. We have to feel free while we're writing.
I think there's a way of, it kind of comes back to what Elif was saying earlier about making things multiple and courting that multiplicity. This is completely, this is a completely false binary, but I used to think in this way, that there was a part of me that was a writer that was so freaking and earnestly passionate. Like, I had to tell the truth. This was the truth. It had to be said. And there's something about my life as an academic, which, that training I really, really appreciate. And something about doing a kind of critical PhD that does not believe in anything that is singular, that courts the messiness of things. I do believe that's a false binary between the supposedly creative and the supposedly academic mind, but I think a big part of writing for me is bringing those two things together. That writing for me should never make something less complex. It should make something more complex. Writing should make the world messy. It should never simplify. It should never make things easy. You should come out of writing being more confused about the world rather than, oh, that's the answer. And I think it's courting those two kinds of perspectives. That's just important for me as a writer. Let me introduce to you the mess of this situation. Let me show you why this is not that simple. And which is all of what this collection is about. It's all about there are so many perspectives. The cartographer's perspective is challenged, and by the end you realize he's not wrong. It's just that things are multiple, that the Rastaman who is launching the most brilliant critique, he is way too earnest. And there is something about his earnestness that has to be critiqued and has to be unsteadied by the end. And it's just leaving you with things are complex. And there's just no single answer.
I think that's kind of a wonderful point to end on, actually, because we've really, I think, charted around this idea of not seeing things through a simple sort of exhaustivized lens and looking at things actually as they are in all of their complexity. And thank you both so much for your readings, and thank you to the audience. I think we'll be around for a little bit afterwards if you want to stay and chat. And thank you to everyone who's been watching online. And join us again next time for the next Writer's Return, and do buy the books of these wonderful writers. They're really amazing. Thank you again, and thank you to the Anthony Burgess Centre. Thank you very much.